The US and Europe have got some quite sort of meaty antitrust concerns about some of the big tech companies who are also operating in the AI space. And, to some extent, the sort of what tool you use, do you use AI regulation or do you use antitrust? The goal is the same, which is to prevent some very, very big, powerful players having too much power. And that is an interesting sort of like interplay that I don't think we know how that's going to go on.
So welcome to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series of podcasts where I get to have incisive discussions with some of the leading thinkers in the digital space on some of the most important topics affecting our world. I'm William Webb. I'm the CTO at Access Partnership, the world's leading tech policy advisory firm. And today I'm talking to Sarah Hunter, a technology and policy strategist, and we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence. Sarah's built a career working at the intersection of technology, culture, and public policy. She spent over a decade as a director of global public policy at Google X, where she helped invent and launch a whole range of new technologies to solve some of the world's most intractable problems. Prior to that, she was Prime Minister Tony Blair's senior policy advisor on culture, media and sport in Downing Street. And since leaving Google, she's taken on a wide range of roles in global panels, as trustees, as a non-executive director across a wide range of different bodies. So Sarah, welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast. Do you want to start off by telling us a bit about what you've been doing in AI in the last few years, and then we'll head into kind of what's going on in the world of AI?
Sure. Thanks for having me. AI is something that I've been working in and around for a long time now. I think, in the public debate, it sort of burst onto the scene in the last year with the launch of ChatGPT. But actually, AI as a technology or as a set of technologies has been around for many decades. And most recently at X, where I was working until very recently, we'd been working on technologies where AI was a core part of the system for many, many years. Self-driving cars may feel like old hat now, but when we launched them 10 years ago, that was one of the first applications of machine learning. And at X, we've worked in AI in aviation, in the context of drones, in biotech, in climate tech. Every bit of modern technology nowadays has got some sort of AI built in.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's important to remember. It's easy to sort of think it's a new thing because of ChatGPT, and that's been very visible, and it's something that every consumer can kind of engage in and think, oh yes, I'm using AI. But of course, whenever you use a smart speaker or any kind of assistant on your phone, or even when you type an email and it suggests the next words for you, that's AI.
Yes, exactly. Many of one of the sort of jokes in AI is that something's AI until it works, and then it just becomes software. We move on and go to something different. So I think it's important, though, to point that out, because to some extent, like some of the sort of the fear mongering around AI is predicated on it being stuff we don't understand. And actually, when we do understand it, it just becomes software like anything else. And we don't have to sort of over panic, if you like, about what it's going to do to our jobs and our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I've certainly come to the same conclusion. But of course, we're talking in just a week or two after the UK AI Safety Summit, designed to overcome all these potential issues with AI, where Rishi Sunak gathered 100 or so guests at Bletchley Park. And I think it's worth sort of just reflecting on, what did that achieve? Did it achieve much? I'm always a bit skeptical about bringing together lots of very high-profile people who don't really have the subject matter expertise and have got lots of political things going on in their lives, just for a couple of days to try and solve really difficult, intractable problems. So I wasn't expecting too much. I think I saw more or less what I was expecting. But what's your take on what they managed to do there?
I'm a little more generous than that, actually.
Okay.
I think, number one, convening is quite powerful. It seems a bit sort of pointless just getting people in a room, but actually the nature of convening means that people have to have gone through a sort of internal process figuring out, what are we going to say? What do we believe? And so on new topics like this, just that is quite useful. And credit to the government and the envoy Matt Clifford, who I know quite well. He's the chair of the board at ARIA that I'm on.
Right.
Persuading China and America to be in the same room is hard, and I think that shouldn't be underestimated. In terms of the substance, though, I'm with you. You don't sort of agree international negotiation positions over a 2-day event. But again, credit to the government. I'm not sure this is how they intended to happen. The fact that the OECD launched their guidelines that week, the US launched their executive order that week. Like, the timing was related, I imagine.
Yes.
So we do now have substantive bits of policy in some regions that we may not have had at the same, as quickly if it had happened.
Yeah. And certainly, what I was pleased about, I've been of the view that any AI regulation needs to be global, ideally, or at least needs to cover the vast majority of countries where the vast majority of AI development takes place, because otherwise you just go to wherever the easiest regulation is, and move on with that. So it was good to see multiple countries coming together, and it was good to see an agreement from 20 or so countries at the end that they are going to work together on AI. I think the thing that worries me slightly is the pace of that. So, in 6 months, we'll have another summit somewhere else, and then another 6 months, we'll have another summit somewhere else. And it sort of feels like we need regulation a bit faster than that kind of pace.
Yeah, it's that perennial challenge, isn't it, with new technology, which is how does the pace of the natural process of policy making meet the pace of technology? To some extent, you don't want policy making to be as fast as technology, because these sort of quick reactions are not what good policy is made of. Good policy is made of looking at trends, looking at actual behavior in the wild, and then sort of stepping in. At the same time, do we have time when it comes to technology that not just moves this fast, but is being used this fast? And I think that is maybe where there might be a meeting, if you like, of the technology and the policy landscape, which is, I think there was some concern about how OpenAI launched ChatGPT, that they had good reasons, they think, for making it a mass market product very, very quickly. But maybe there's some sort of more gradual, incremental launch process that these powerful foundation models need in the future to avoid it being sort of, 0 to 100 in a global context, with all those sort of safety ramifications alongside.
Yeah, no, I agree. But you mentioned, I think rightly, that around about the same time we had the US coming out with a whole raft of regulation. And of course, we've got the EU, which has long had its AI regulation. Are we actually heading towards global regulation despite the aspirations of the Bletchley Park Summit? Or does it look like, in fact, that's just sort of window dressing and different countries are going to go their own way? And there's going to be a bit of a battle as to whether the EU regulations or the US regulations win out and become the most widely adopted.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and we've seen it in privacy legislation, for example, in the past, what the governments do is less interesting than how the companies react, right? And so by that, I mean, when GDPR came out, the companies, most of which were US based, had to apply GDPR to their products because they were operating in European markets. And as a result, it was just easier to say, right, all of our products will now meet GDPR standards everywhere in the world because we've got to build it for one. It's simpler and cheaper to build it for everyone. Yeah. So I think that will be the interesting thing, is how will the big tech companies who have these global products respond to the first piece of legislation that actually has real bite and real market share. It doesn't matter if a tiny country does it. What matters is if really big countries and big regions, markets do it. And what then happens to the other regulatory systems? Yes. Do they just follow suit? Do they try and do something different? I mean, I think that is quite unpredictable, actually.
It is. And the GDPR example is widely quoted because it's an interesting and clear example. But I don't know. I don't think we're going to see the same thing here, at least not from the EU. It just seems to me that the EU's regulation is a bit it's just not quite right. It was written before ChatGPT and other things were invented. It was then sort of tweaked, but it feels too intrusive. And it feels to me like a number of the big companies, who are mostly American anyway, might say, well, actually, we'll go with the US one, and we'll hope that Europe changes its regulation towards the US, because otherwise we'll just not go there. And that kind of brinkmanship might play out over the coming years.
I think you always have some companies sort of crying wolf and saying, if you launch this, we're going to pull out. And, sometimes it happens a little bit, but in the end, you get to a sort of a happy medium, because the countries want to have these products because they know the citizens want them and the companies want them too. I think what's interesting about now is that the White House's executive order is so much more expansive than anything they've done, for example, in privacy, like GDPR in the past. And so actually for the US tech companies, it's rather handy, because you can say, look, we're US companies, we're going to comply with US law. And guess what? It has the same intent as much of the European legislation. It's just doing it in a much more sort of US friendly way. Things like the First Amendment, for example, is like the free speech sort of foundation of so many tech companies in the US is both culturally and legally really well established. So anything that in Europe, for example, undermines that, they're not going to be happy to well, they won't comply with. So I do think the sort of the extensiveness of the American approach will, to your point, it give them a reason not to be so sort of European minded on this one.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then, as you said, there'll probably be a message back to Brussels saying, look, unless you come more in line with the US, sorry guys, we're just not going to go there, kind of thing.
Yeah, but will they do it? I mean, I genuinely, like, as you know, the European Union do not enjoy having Americans tell them what to do. And to some extent, that's part of the problem. Yeah. So, it may be that there are sort of one of the things that I think is sort of not as well understood or debated yet is the overlap between the AI regulatory regimes and the antitrust movements that are happening in both regions. Both the US and Europe have got some quite sort of meaty antitrust concerns about some of the big tech companies who are also operating in the AI space. And, to some extent, the sort of what tool you use, do you use AI regulation or do you use antitrust? The goal is the same, which is to prevent some very, very big, powerful players having too much power. And that is an interesting sort of like interplay that I don't think we know how that's going to go either.
No, and you're right. At the moment, it looks like that's the way things are going. That the large foundational models are so difficult to do, require so much spend that there's only going to be a few of them. But it's not clear whether that's too much of an issue, because there'll be lots of stuff happening around the edge of them that means lots of companies effectively just take that as an input. Yeah, a bit like we don't care too much that there's only one broadband provider to the home, because all of the stuff that's interesting happens over the top of that. And as long as the prices aren't too high for the broadband provider, we don't care. Right. And as long as they have an open kind of interface. So it'd be interesting to see whether that's what plays out in the foundational model, or whether we end up with actually the likes of Microsoft and Google and others really controlling everything from that point.
And, I mean, you have a bit like sort of, 15 years ago, you have all the copyrighted industries all sort of claiming foul on the use of their data in the building these foundational models. You are bound to have a bit of a political moment here, I think. The copyright industries remain very politically influential. And so whether that plays out in new legislation proposals or actual legal challenge, the drive towards actually smaller models, models that don't have as much copyrighted material utilized. Smaller models also avoid some of these antitrust concerns, avoid some of the kind of enormous amount of computing power you need to build and money you need to build these models. So again, the sort of the how does the AI sector evolve to sort of address some of these new challenges they're seeing in their way? That might in itself address some of the sort of the antitrust concerns that actually, may come to nothing.
Interesting point. So actually, it may be those kind of things rather than that sort of headline regulation that actually really drives what transpires over the coming few years.
Yeah, inevitably, the sort of the technology is still nascent, and actually the cost of compute and the cost of talent is a real limiting factor in a way that sort of threat of possible regulation isn't. And so actually the sort of the business models, the ways you actually compete in this market, I think will be a much quicker driver of change than anything that the EU might do in 2 years' time.
Yeah. And in terms of, I mean, we talked about whether the threats are overstated, and we'll come to kind of the real sort of existential stuff later on. But it feels to me that the most immediate threats are actually not really AI's fault as such. It's more the way that it's used, and that's the manipulation of information to influence elections or other things like that, which of course isn't new. And we've seen, Russian involvement in US elections in the past, but potentially feels like it could step up a gear. That feels like maybe an area where specific regulation might be quite useful, but not necessarily regulating the AI models, but regulating the platforms that host the information that's then effectively wrongly influencing people.
Yeah, I did think it was interesting when ChatGPT sort of burst onto the scene, how it made the conversation about AI actually the same kind of conversation we had about social media, but on steroids.
Yeah.
As I said at the beginning, having worked in AI in cars, in aviation, like it felt to me a sort of unwelcome return to some of the kind of debates we'd had around Facebook, for example, over the last 10 years. So I think you're right. There's kind of a need to kind of regroup, if you like, and say, what's new here? Do we have tools that actually we've developed in recent years that we can use to manage this risk? Or is our failure to regulate social media now actually forcing us to go back to first principles and say, what do we actually need to do here in the context of social media? I agree with you that of all the threats that AI poses, misinformation and democratic election integrity is the most worrying for me, and the one that I felt was worryingly sort of overlooked in the context of the AI summit. It seemed to me really obvious that as democratically elected leaders, you'd be really worried if that process was going to be undermined. And yet it was, I think Rishi Sunak said he's got a task force looking at it, which felt to me very underpowered compared to a 2-day summit where, international leaders come together and talk about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I wonder whether there'll be a moment where, so for example, it wasn't AI at all, but we saw in the Israel dispute where there was that explosion in the hospital, and it immediately caused riots everywhere. And then it took a few hours for people to realize it probably wasn't an Israeli missile. Actually, it probably was a failure of a Palestinian missile. But in that short space of time, all sorts of terrible things happened before people could even start to get their heads around it. And I wonder whether there'll be some, I don't know, fake video of some senior politician or something that goes out and causes very rapid reaction, and a few hours later you can say actually it's not real, but by that time the damage has been done. I worry more about the subtle sort of attempts to influence culture that make people vote in a much more populist way. Looking at sort of the Cambridge Analytica sort of read up after all the research was published. It seems like, it's not adverts that sort of are very obviously faked that are the problem. What's the problem is imagery of kind of riots happening at ports that make people vote against immigration policies, for example, because they're afraid. And that's a really hard one to regulate for.
And so I really hope that we have sort of civil society as well as politicians talking about how to manage this sort of post-truth environment in the context of elections, and what's the way that all of us can inoculate ourselves against that sort of misinformation.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's, I think that's, as you said, that's not really an AI debate, but it's become a more important debate because of AI.
Right. I mean, it means that, like, creative campaigns, which, advertising agencies have spent many years claiming are very expensive and very talent-driven things to produce, are much easier to do. So if you have the right prompts, theoretically, a generative AI model can produce both imagery and text that is very well targeted at the audience you're trying to motivate. Now, it can be used for bad, but it can also be used for good. And so that a bit of me thinks actually we need the sort of pro-democracy campaigners to utilize these foundation models for their own purposes as well. And then it balances it out. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know, but I do worry that a task force is not going to be the way we solve it.
To do that. Yeah. And I guess that's part of the risk that people think that, great, we're now regulating AI, and actually what they're poking at is possibly the wrong place to poke at this point in time, at least. I mean, maybe some point in the future it might be important, but right now it's not.
I was saying to a journalist last week, one of the sort of interesting possibilities is that, newspapers have for many years been worrying about the internet eating their lunch. Maybe actually the internet is eating itself, and actually the role of newspapers as truth-giving organisations and organisations like the BBC and Wikipedia, for example, their status becomes much more valuable, and actually we might see a resurgence in those sources of information becoming more fashionable again.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. As people increasingly distrust stuff that comes from random sources, it does make it more important.
Right.
So what about the existential threat? We heard Elon Musk say that robots are going to climb trees and get us, which I think he was talking in jest. But nevertheless, that's out there, and there's possibly something like half of the experts, or supposed experts on AI, seem to worry about something existential. I'm still trying to get my head around quite what this existential threat really is, and part of me sort of thinks, well, if it looks like it's doing bad things, then you just turn the switch off. Now, I know it's not quite as easy when it's embedded on millions of computers around the world, but I still struggle to really understand why people are so worried about that space. I mean, is it something you worry about, or do you?
I do. I think all of us should worry about the end of life. We worry about climate change. That's real. We should worry about some of this stuff. And I have, I've spent some time talking and listening to, as you said, the AI leaders who do think it's existential. I don't know if they're right. I don't think any of us know if they're right. No. But even if there's a small amount of risk, we should take it seriously. And particularly in the sort of the AI systems right now can share information with us, but they can't actuate things. They can't then take, information about my calendar and then book things in my calendar, for example. But as soon as you give, autonomous systems the power to actuate things, then I think you do get into categories where they actuate things that you don't want to actuate, and thus the sort of the runaway risk becomes more real. So I do think it's a thing, and the people who are building it, being the ones who worry about the thing, is probably the right place to worry about it, because they are the only people who can advise us on, well, how do you mitigate against that thing happening? The bit that I worry about more, frankly, is the real short-term harms that are happening right now. I sort of think it's a cop-out to say, let's worry about some time in the future and let's ignore the people who are having loans turned down because a system judged them to be, unfit for money purposes, or the people who, were pulled out of a sort of, police lineup because of a photo that wasn't them. I mean, those are the things that are happening right now. to people who don't have a voice. And that, I think, is unforgivable. Again, for democratically elected governments to ignore those people is wrong.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think, arguably that could be sort of existential, if in so much as if all of law and order breaks down because essentially there's no trust anymore in the police or the government because of things that happen that people look at and say, that's clearly means that I can't trust any of those people anymore. Then you've got something that could lead to something that does cause a kind of New Orleans after the flooding and the hurricane kind of scenario, where it does very quickly sometimes break down into anarchy.
Totally. I mean, Kamala Harris, I think, had the best line about, is it not existential for a person who's been wrongfully arrested, that the AI was part of it? I mean, I think she very brilliantly and very elegantly pointed this out. But I also agree with you that, that the trust in systems is a really fragile thing. And I think we haven't quite acknowledged, or the governments of the world haven't quite acknowledged, that when we're trying to use AI for good stuff, trust in those systems is really, really important. And we're starting to chip away at that by utilizing in ways that fail, or by talking about killer robots. The trust in public systems is really important to retain if you want to keep on having people use these systems. And I don't think we're really investing in that enough.
Yeah, no, I agree. And another example, again, nothing to do with AI, but I remember when there was the issues with the Metropolitan Police and a woman was murdered as a result, and then sort of the advice was, well, go around in pairs and things like that. But that in itself undermined deeply people's trust, particularly women's trust in policing. And that's only one isolated incident. So you could easily imagine how some kind of just misinformation or the police using an algorithm that turned out, unfortunately, to be hugely biased or similar could very rapidly lead to distrust in that area. So I think that's right, that if I were looking at regulation, that's where I'd want to look at, is actually the use of the AI models and less the actual generation of them. Although, as you rightly say, there's issues around copyright and so on. But right now, it's people using the models that seems to be the challenge.
Totally. Yeah. And I think trust as a concept is sort of researched a lot in academic circles, and actually within tech companies. I certainly know from my time at Google that user trust is one of the most valuable things you have. In competitive markets where you're not charging for your product, people could just click to use your competitor. So it's really important in everything you do to ensure that users trust you. We don't have that same debate within government. We sort of take it for granted that we are we are the arm of the public, and therefore we're trusted. And actually, it's a really, really, being user centric, which is what tech companies are, is a really useful skill that I think governments could benefit from as well, and actually need to when we start to use digital public services a lot more.
And that's, in a way, that's a really interesting insight, and it sort of kind of brings us almost full circle, and we're kind of getting towards the end of our time anyway. But I think what we're getting to is we're saying, it's great that the summit happened. It's good that people recognise that there are issues here, but perhaps the focus, at least short-term focus, is not right. It's looking at the underlying models, and actually where the issues are more likely to happen is in the use of those models, and in particular from entities where trust is critical, and a breakdown in trust could lead to a substantial breakdown in society. And I think your point at the very end, that governments need to be very careful about how they use it, but they also need to think about the fact that trust is critical in the fact that we accept being taxed or whatever. And as soon as that trust falls away, then there are substantial problems there. So, focusing a lot more on that and a lot less on can we get investment from large AI companies, and how can we get them to innovate is probably where we should be heading. Do you think that's a fair summary?
I do. And I think, if I was working in a government now, I'd be thinking, goodness, there are so many great things we can use machine learning for within government. Government needs to catch up with the way the rest of our lives is run, and actually using AI to help, for example, deliver public services.
Yeah.
Particularly in economically challenging climates, a great thing to do. So let's pick some services where the benefits are high, but we can also, as a government, learn about how to manage and implement the risks. And through that exercise, then we'll become a lot better at regulating the wider AI universe. Because this is only going to get more and more mainstream, and governments need to catch up really quickly to understand how to do it well.
Perfect. That's a lovely summary. And that brings us to the end of our time. Sarah, it's been great to chat to you. I've learned a lot, actually. It's been a really useful discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been really fun.